In 1996, Capcom released Resident Evil, known as Biohazard in Japan, a game that would go on to define the survival horror genre, and soon become widely celebrated as one of the best and most influential games of all time. There are many reasons as to why Resident Evil gained the accolades it did. The visceral horror on display throughout, the dark and haunting setting of the Spencer Mansion, the creepy and well executed sound effects, and the right music in the right places all have a subtle cumulative effect on the player as they desperately try to survive. These are all aspects of Resident Evil that have been appropriately highlighted, applauded and used as inspiration for not just future entries in the series, but horror games as a whole. However, there's one key aspect that I feel has slightly fallen by the wayside in the near 30 years since Resident Evil 1's release. One vital piece of the game's overall puzzle that, if it were to not exist, the game itself would not be the same. I'm of course talking about the usage of STARS, the Special Tactics and Rescue Service. Our key cast of characters in Resident Evil 1 are members of STARS, who are split between Alpha Team and Bravo Team. The game primarily follows Alpha Team, with key members Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine being the two protagonists players can choose to control. Throughout the game's lore as well as supplemental material of the wider Resident Evil series, STARS is stated to be a highly skilled group made up of multiple ex-military personnel and academic experts, with each member being extremely efficient in their given role. To help add a bit more context for the rest of this video, let's quickly go through each member of STARS and the role they play in their respective teams. Chris Redfield serves as Alpha Team's point man. His years as a member of the United States Air Force and his talent for precise handling of multiple firearm types make Chris a well-respected member of STARS as well as its top marksman. Jill Valentine got her start in the United States Army, where her unique Delta Force training gave her many talents in bomb disposal and lockpicking. Following a stint in the US Air Force with Chris Redfield, Barry Burton joined STARS as Alpha Team's backup man. With a vast knowledge of firearms, Barry soon becomes STARS' overall weapons supervisor, helping his teammates choose their most optimal weaponry. Brad Vickers is Alpha Team's rear security, computer expert and resident pilot. Though it's up for debate if Brad ever had the same military experience as the majority of his teammates, his ability to fulfill many roles for the team makes him a valuable member, though his lack of combat experience holds him back. Joseph Frost is Alpha Team's Omni-Man and equipment maintenance technician. Joseph's eagerness, curiosity and brashness makes his handling of dangerous goods a bold choice, though there are legitimate concerns over his energetic nature not being ideal in serious situations. The leader of both Alpha Team and STARS as a whole, Albert Wesker's placement into STARS is shrouded in mystery, but his effectiveness as a leader and experience in the field as a former US Army officer gains him the respect of his fellow STARS operatives. Enrico Marini serves as the much respected leader of Bravo Team. His long period of service in the American Army and SWAT making him the perfect person to serve directly under Wesker and oversee Bravo Team. The backup man and communications expert for Bravo Team is Richard Aken. The tragic loss of his sister when he was younger, combined with the ability to easily read people, has given Richard the desire to protect those around him, with his willingness to sacrifice his own life in order to save another, making him a popular member of the team. Forrest Speyer is Bravo Team's Omni-Man and STARS' resident sharpshooter, with his marksmanship only rivaled by his good friend Chris. His charisma and full-of-life character makes him a well-liked member of STARS, but Forrest's perfectionism is what truly makes him reliable when it comes to getting the job done. Bravo Team's point man and chemist is Kenneth J. Sullivan. As the oldest member of STARS, any doubts that Kenneth has towards his worth in the team are overshadowed by his immense experience and talent in certain fields, with him even rivaling Enrico in multiple ways. Working as Bravo Team's pilot and rear security, Edward Dewey became a well-respected member of the team thanks to his quick-thinking mechanical skills and desire to protect his younger teammates. A child prodigy and a talented chemist, rookie Rebecca Chambers is the youngest member of STARS and serves as Bravo Team's rear security, medic and chemicals expert. Rebecca is highly protected by her much older teammates and as a result is determined to prove her worth in STARS. Okay, so that was a lot of people to go through, but there is a reason for it. It's because that all of these characters, through one way or another, are what makes the horror of Resident Evil 1's premise so damn effective. The game begins on the 24th of July 1998, more than 24 hours after Bravo Team's journey to investigate the grisly murders in the Arklay Mountains ended in silence. Alpha Team are sent out to find their comrades, only to discover the remains of Bravo's helicopter, albeit with no sign of the team themselves. After spreading out to search for more clues, Joseph Frost makes a horrifying discovery: a severed hand still clutching their handgun. Now, it's never actually clarified within Resident Evil 1 itself who this hand belongs to, but the general consensus is that this hand belongs to Edward Dewey. This is eventually confirmed by Capcom themselves in supplementary material, as well as the beta version of Resident Evil 0 back when the prequel game was originally being developed for the Nintendo 64. In this version of the game, which still featured Bravo Team rookie Rebecca Chambers as the protagonist, Edward looks to be missing one of his hands, further confirming that the hand originally found by Joseph in Resident Evil 1 was indeed his. Given that Edward is never shown or mentioned at any other point in Resident Evil 1, this discovery marks him, canonically, as the first member of STARS to die in both the original Resident Evil and its remake, released in 2002, dying at some point on the 23rd of July 1998. However, the key difference between the original and the remake is the removal of Edward's severed hand and the addition of Kevin Dooley, an RPD police helicopter pilot that is loaned out to STARS when Edward is needed on the ground. Kevin serves as the replacement for Edward's hand, his mauled body being the thing that Joseph discovers upon Alpha Team finding Bravo's crashed helicopter. This change would go on to affect Resident Evil Zero's final product too, having restarted development on the Nintendo GameCube alongside the Resident Evil remake. For Edward, however, his fate in the released version of Resident Evil Zero is shown for the first time, with him being attacked and chased by dogs before crashing through the window of a nearby train and meeting Rebecca Chambers, now sporting both his hands intact, where he warns her of the threat in the Arklay Mountains before passing away shortly afterwards from his wounds. Eventually, Rebecca comes across a zombified Edward and is left with no choice but to put down her friend and ally, the first of many losses Rebecca and Bravo Team would have to face during the events of the Arklay incident. 24 hours later, on the 24th of July, Joseph Frost has discovered the disembodied hand of Edward, but is soon attacked by a pack of zombified dogs and is torn to pieces before he can even alert his teammates. Joseph's death is a quick but extremely brutal one, with there being almost no time for any of Alpha Team to save him. With no choice but to retreat and come back with more firepower, the rest of Alpha Team attempt to fall back to their helicopter, only to see Brad Vickers flee with it and their supplies in fear, unable to cope with the escalating situation after witnessing Joseph's horrific death. After retreating to a nearby mansion, what's left of Alpha Team briefly assess their situation. No weapons, no idea where they are, and at least 2 of their members confirmed to be dead. What's worse is that one of your Alpha Team cohorts is missing. Chris if you're playing as Jill, and Barry if you selected Chris. After splitting up to scout their current location, the chosen player character soon makes another truly horrifying discovery. Kenneth Sullivan is dead, his body ripped apart and ravaged by a lone zombie. It's unfortunately too late to help Kenneth, who's already long past the point of saving by the time you find him. All you're left with is to deal with his murderer before mourning his loss and returning to report his death to the others. What is already a very bad situation is soon made even worse, however, when the player later discovers that their captain Albert Wesker has disappeared from the main hall. Now leaderless, the player has no other choice but to continue exploring the mansion on their own, where they eventually come across another member of Bravo Team in Forrest Speyer, a skilled marksman who's soon revealed to have been pecked to death by a murder of crows.
It's Forrest! Oh my god!
His eyes gone, his skin peeled back, and his flesh consumed. One of the best sharpshooters in STARS, mutilated by a common bird. How could this have happened? But it's not over yet for Forrest. Forrest too has now joined the ranks of the living dead. Your close friend and ally, once considered one of the most trustworthy members of STARS, his infected wounds having turned him into a zombie that now threatens your life. Left with no other choice, you are forced to defend yourself and kill one of your fellow STARS in an act of mercy. This is where the real horror of Resident Evil truly begins. In the case of Edward, you have no idea what could have actually happened to him. He could have been attacked as suddenly as Joseph was, with simply no time to prepare himself properly. Their deaths, as tragic as they are, were almost unavoidable. But with Kenneth and now Forrest dead, things are more serious than you ever could have possibly imagined. 4 of your teammates are dead. 4 of your friends. And don't forget, your squad is not your average run-of-the-mill group of cops. These are trained professionals. Soldiers with decades of combined experience, and they are just dropping like flies around you. This is the secret weapon behind Resident Evil 1. This, in my opinion, is what truly makes the horror of this game so damn effective. If your allies, with all their experience and skills, couldn't stand a chance in this mansion, what hope do you, trapped in the same nightmarish hellhole with even less weapons and gear on hand, have of surviving? But survive you must. Once you delve deeper into the mansion, you come across Richard Aken, so severely wounded by a giant snake that he can barely speak. The venom coursing through his body is so strong that even if you're able to find a serum in time, it doesn't matter. He dies a painful death regardless. Richard, one of the most beloved members of STARS, is now dead as well. It was already a tragedy with the deaths of Edward, Joseph, Kenneth and Forrest, but as one of his friends and comrades, Richard dying on top of them would be almost too much to bear.
Richard! No!
Richard!
Rebecca! Be careful!
Richard! Richard! Are you...
Rebecca.
Granted, in the remake, Richard is able to be cured of the venom should players be able to find the serum in time. Richard later returns to either save Jill from Yawn, the giant snake, or Chris from Neptune, the giant shark, sacrificing his life in the process to save his teammate. It's a nice addition to Richard's selfless character that was only briefly highlighted in the original game, but the outcome is the same regardless. A much needed ally is dead, a much loved friend is gone, and the mansion once again claims another victim. However, there is some much needed hope. While playing as Chris, the player comes across none other than STARS' latest recruit, the genius chemist Rebecca Chambers, who has managed to survive with the help of Richard, her hiding spot in the downstairs save room, and her makeshift defensive spray, which she uses on Chris in one of the game's scarce but much needed humorous scenes.
Whoa! What is it?
What? Oh! Oh no! Sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
You must be from the Bravo team.
Yes, I'm Rebecca. Rebecca Chambers. I'm a newcomer. I just joined the STARS Bravo team last month.
At this point in the game, Rebecca can become Chris's ally, helping in a similar way to how Barry Burton helps Jill throughout her campaign, though not as effective. Still, Rebecca is a much needed burst of hope for the surviving STARS members, who continue to find a way to rescue their remaining allies and escape the mansion. The first real lifeline that STARS receives from outside the mansion comes from a broken radio that Richard can give the player if they're able to give him the serum before he dies. The radio unfortunately can't make any outgoing calls, but can still receive them, as proven when the player can hear beeping when reaching certain areas of the mansion. If the player is quick enough to activate the radio in their inventory, then they are met by a shocking revelation.
This is Brad. STARS Alpha Team. Please respond. What the hell? Is nobody out there?
Brad, this is Jill.
Brad Vickers, Alpha Team's cowardly pilot, has returned to save them. This is now the best chance the remaining STARS have to be rescued, but Brad is unable to ascertain the fate of his comrades, and the player is unable to confirm their survival or whereabouts to him. Nonetheless, the player continues looking for a way out, eventually making their way to the caves deep underneath the mansion. There they find a wounded Enrico Marini, the leader of Bravo Team, who's become so fearful and paranoid due to his experiences in the mansion that he turns his gun on his fellow STARS comrades. Enrico is convinced that STARS have been betrayed by one of their own, unsure if the player is there to help him or kill him. Enrico's suspicions are soon proven true, however, as he is suddenly assassinated by the traitor in question before he can reveal anything else of note. Enrico's death is a catastrophic setback for the surviving STARS members, not only because of the death of one of their most seasoned and trusted allies, but because of the revelation that someone among them has betrayed them. Since they arrived in the Arklay Mountains, STARS had been in a desperate fight for survival against the many bioorganic abominations that had taken the lives of their allies one by one. Just being able to survive was already an uphill battle, but now they must fight for survival against one of their own, who actively seeks their destruction. The remaining stars still alive eventually make their way to the labs beneath the mansion, where they discover not only the source of the outbreak that claimed the lives of the dozens killed in the Arklay Mountains, but none other than Captain Albert Wesker, who reveals himself to be the traitor. This entire time, Wesker has been working for Umbrella, the owners of the mansion and the company responsible for creating the T-Virus. Wesker's betrayal is one that hits deep, as the entire STARS platoon, who had grown to become their own type of family, were in truth betrayed by the one member they trusted the most to protect them. Even worse is that Wesker has already turned his back on Umbrella too, who want the evidence of their crimes in the mansion covered up, and STARS, their biggest obstacle in achieving that goal, to be destroyed. But Wesker simply wants to keep the results of the T-Virus for himself, his desire for power being more important to him than the lives of his supposed friends and allies. Edward, Joseph, Kenneth, Forrest, Richard, Enrico. Every death, every friend lost, every ally that couldn't be saved. All of their blood now rests on the hands of a man who couldn't care less about them or their fate. While you, the player, as Chris or Jill, had been desperately fighting for survival, watching your friends and allies die one by one, Wesker stood there, watching his plan go off perfectly. Not content to just work alone, however, Wesker had also blackmailed Barry Burton into helping him destroy STARS, dangling the lives of Barry's beloved family in front of him in order to guarantee his cooperation in betraying his friends and family. Tragically, Wesker's threats are a mere lie, designed to strike Barry's weak spot and scare him into submission. Barry soon rejoins his allies after learning of Wesker's ruse, but the shame of having been deceived in the first place, as well as his hand in STARS' destruction, haunts him for the rest of his life. Regardless, Wesker tries to finish off the last of his once loyal subordinates, only to be suddenly impaled by the Tyrant, the ultimate end product of the Umbrella's T-Virus, an ironic fate for the captain who had lauded the abomination as the ultimate life form. With Wesker now presumed dead alongside the men he had betrayed, STARS are forced to fend off the powerful Tyrant while facing down the mansion's imminent self-destruction. In a last desperate rush, Chris, Jill, Barry and Rebecca, the last surviving members of STARS inside the mansion, make their escape to a nearby helipad, where a timely flare finally gets the attention of Brad Vickers, who arrives to rescue them. However, they are forced to face off against the Tyrant one final time, with a last-minute lifeline in the form of a rocket launcher provided by Brad being the killing blow needed to put down Umbrella's ultimate life form for good. With their escape and the subsequent explosion of the Spencer Mansion, STARS is now reduced from a team of 12 incredibly skilled soldiers to a meagre 5 heavily fatigued and shell-shocked survivors. It's a tragic fate for STARS, and it's only by a miracle that Chris, Jill, Barry, Rebecca and Brad are able to escape with their lives. The destruction of STARS, however, continues beyond the events of the first game, as Brad Vickers meets his own eventual end during the Raccoon City outbreak several months later, being brutally killed by the STARS pursuing tyrant Nemesis before being put down for good as a roaming zombie by one of the few remaining survivors. When Albert Wesker is killed by Chris in 2009, having managed to survive the mansion incident, the book on STARS' tragic story is closed for good, with the 4 remaining survivors able to move on, content that their murdered allies are avenged and that their betrayer can never pose a threat to the world again. Now, obviously, Resident Evil is a video game. You, the player, as either Jill or Chris, are always destined to defy the odds and escape the Spencer Mansion with your lives, otherwise the game itself wouldn't be very long at all. It's also true that finding your deceased allies throughout the game can become less and less effective beyond your first initial playthrough of Resident Evil 1, especially when the game promotes playing through the game at least twice as Chris and Jill in order to get the full experience. The overall hokiness of the original game's voice acting and dialogue also doesn't exactly help sell the severity of what's going on around you.
Jill, this house is dangerous. There are terrible demons. Ouch!
But to me, these things don't make STARS' fate any less of a tragedy to experience and a horror to witness, and it certainly doesn't make STARS anything less than an extremely vital part of the game, or the series as a whole, because the pain of STARS' cruel fate is something that affects the surviving characters deeply and permeates throughout the whole series. A good example of this that I only recently discovered is in the Japanese-only guidebook Inside of Biohazard, released in 1997, where there are multiple pages that are dedicated to a somewhat novice-friendly walkthrough of the game, but is presented as Chris and Jill's report on the events of the mansion incident. While these are mostly just designed to guide players through the mansion's many areas, some select quotes from Chris and Jill's report highlight how the deaths of their comrades and their failures to save them truly affected the pair. I want to know what Enrico, Richard and everyone else had lost their lives for. That's why I'm helping with this messy investigation. We must do something to prevent such incidents from happening again. From the first testimony of C. Redfield. When I got down to the caves, I found that all of the underground passages were damp, except for one. So, I'm sorry, I just remembered Enrico a little. Yes, I know there was nothing I could have done, but if I had been a little more competent, a little more insightful in this matter, he might not be dead. After all, he was the only victim in this case who was directly attacked by the traitor. From J. Valentine's fourth testimony. With the deaths of their friends and betrayal by Wesker fueling them, the surviving members of STARS go on to dedicate their lives to the dissolution of Umbrella and ensure the threat of bioorganic weapons are removed from the world, with Chris and Jill in particular eventually co-founding the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance as a spiritual successor of sorts to their original squad. While making this video, I kinda realised that the whole setup of STARS in general is actually very reminiscent of James Cameron's Aliens, released in 1986, where we see a platoon of macho soldiers be massacred by alien life forms that they just could not have possibly been prepared for. In the same way that the killing of the Colonial Marines were effective in building up the threat of the aliens and the question of how these survivors are going to escape from Hadley's Hope, the killing of STARS 2 is effective in filling players with a similar sense of dread, making them wonder how they themselves will escape the Spencer Mansion alive. How will they manage to avoid the fate of their seasoned allies? How will they overcome the impossible enemy that stands in the way of their freedom and their lives if the ones who came before them couldn't? It's because of these questions that we realise that STARS is a vital part of the game's premise, and that a Resident Evil 1 without STARS is like an Aliens without Colonial Marines. Sure, it could still work, but it just wouldn't be the same. The entire premise of playing as a squad of highly trained and skilled soldiers that are thrust into a situation they can't possibly have been prepared for is, to me, what makes Resident Evil 1 Resident Evil 1. The same way that removing the setting of Raccoon City and the things that draw Claire Redfield and Leon Kennedy to it would make Resident Evil 2 not feel like Resident Evil 2. If you couldn't tell already, STARS is one of my favourite parts of the entire Resident Evil series, and this setup is a major reason why. I just love the nature of how the events in the game play out as you find your allies one by one as you progress, and I just can't imagine this game not having STARS and still being as amazing and frankly as memorable as it ended up being. And while history will rightfully focus on the many other aspects of the original Resident Evil for what it brought to not just the survival horror genre but gaming as a whole, I'm just glad that this squad of fairly overlooked soldiers exists and that I was able to give them the dues I so rarely see them get. I just really find STARS to be the unsung heroes of Resident Evil's origins. I mean hell, Resident Evil 0 barely showed most of them outside of the opening cutscene, and that was meant to be a prequel to the original game. Capcom themselves couldn't have even pretended to care much about these guys beyond their fates as dead bodies for you to run into in the first game. But who knows, if Resident Evil 1 is fortunate enough to get a third remake at some point in the future, then perhaps we could see the horror of STARS' fate be given new life, and experience a new breed of survival horror with your allies' corpses littered along the way in new, spine-chilling scenarios. But for now, that's just a dream, so I'll give one last salute to this underappreciated group of heroes, who gave their lives so that Resident Evil could live.
Thank you, Rebecca.
We await your return, warrior.